All right, Mr. Brian, you're up. Brian, sir, past president and founder, one of the founding fathers and mothers of Think Trees.
Oh, we got a spotlight right in my face in there. Old men, we don't like being out in the light. Welcome, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here again with all of you and to be able to introduce Paul this morning. I was just asking Paul, my memory is not great, and I didn't get a chance to go through past programs in here, whether this is his second or third, and we kind of decided this is his third appearance at Think Trees in here. And it's my pleasure to be able to introduce Paul Ries to the audience this morning, and I hope you all will pay attention and learn. And the resilience of our forest really depend a lot on our interaction as arborists and community members to participate with our urban entities and help support urban and community forestry. Paul, thank you.
Brian, thanks for making me feel old. I thought it was only 2. So he reminded me the first time I spoke here, I gave the keynote on green. If green is the new gold, why aren't we all rich? And that talk was about the importance of looking at urban forestry and arboriculture and trees and trying to make them more relevant to more people and to tie to things like climate change and whatnot. Then I don't remember what year that was. I'm guessing it might have been 2008 or 9, because that's when I was doing that talk. Came back, I think in 2000, I want to say 12 or 13 or 14, and I gave a talk on connecting people to trees. And if you remember me from that, I juggled during that talk. Does anybody remember that? A few, okay. I'm not going to juggle today. Sorry, wrong course. Thank you to Tom and to Andrew and Marissa and all the folks at Think Trees. I'm very glad to be back here with you. For those of you who haven't heard me speak, I'm going to give you all a disclaimer. Everything I talk about today in this talk and in my last talk of the day, which I hope you'll stick around for, something in here is going to apply to you. Now, full disclosure, I'm a college professor, and sometimes people think, well, you've never been out of a classroom. I didn't become a college professor until about 15 years ago. I've been in urban forestry for 35 years, so you can do the math. I've sat in your seats. I've done most of the work, with the exception of I was never a climber. I've done most of the work in the field of arboriculture and urban forestry at one time or another. I am an ISA certified arborist. My certification number is 65. That tells you that I've been a certified arborist longer than some of you have been alive. And I don't say that to brag, I just tell you that I know trees, but I'm going to talk to you today about what impacts trees. I'm not going to give a very technical talk today. I'm really going to talk about the ways that we can look at preventing more damage to trees. Now, we can't prevent natural disasters. That's a physical impossibility. But we can be prepared for them. So as mentioned, here's kind of a little bit about me. I teach at Oregon State University. I'm half retired, so I teach half-time. I teach all online, and I have a few former students in the room, I'm pretty sure. I have 40 graduate students right now from all over the U.S., Canada, China, Peru, and I have a little consulting business where I do speaking like this, and I do nonprofit training and facilitation. I've worked at the local level, I've worked in the nonprofit level, and at the state level I managed an urban forestry program, much like what you heard about with our speaker from the state of New Mexico. So I've been around a long time, and I've had a lot of different experiences. But to me, I think it's very important, and to me it's very gratifying to come to conferences like this and to share some thoughts with you and try to get you thinking about how to advance your career, advance your professionalism, advance your personal growth and advance your company or organization with regard to the impact and influence that you could have on clients, constituents, peers, and anyone else that you come in contact with. So, I've been asked to speak today about disaster-proofing your urban forest, and I'm going to basically cover the 6 R's: risk, readiness, response, recovery, resources, and resilience. You don't have to write those 6 down. You'll see them throughout this particular session. So I'm going to cover this piece. As indicated, I teach at Oregon State University, but I teach online. I actually live just outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, which is what this photograph is here, where I spend the halftime of retirement doing photography and hiking best I can. By the way, anybody ever been to White Sands National Park? Most of you, but not all. Okay. So I had the good fortune to fly in a day early and drive down to White Sands and take a couple pictures, and maybe I'll sprinkle a couple of those into my talk later this afternoon. Beautiful, beautiful landscape. Very different from what I'm used to. So if you were to look at all the typical natural disasters that urban foresters and arborists and people in the green industry might encounter over their course of their career, or even over the course of a single year, it'd be a fairly long list. For most of us, the things that are stressful on the tree tends to be things that affect the physics of the tree. In other words, the biomechanics of that tree and how that tree responds to stresses. And these are all this list you see on the screen, these are all stresses that a tree encounters in its lifetime. And when we work in the green industry, natural disasters tend to be stressors on us because we have to pick up the pieces, we have to pick up the limbs, we have to pull the dead tree or the damaged tree off of a car, or whatever it happens to be. So we have to try to think about how do we anticipate this. And unfortunately, like most things in life, we tend to be more reactive and less proactive about dealing with natural disasters. So it's my hope today here that you'll focus not so much on the response and the recovery, I'll talk about that, but really on the other pieces of the other ones of these R's to think about how we manage these natural disasters. In recent years, I think there are 3 new ones that we can add to this list: wildfire, climate change, and pandemics. And yes, I would consider the pandemic to be a disaster. You can argue about how natural or man-made it was, but I consider it to have been a disaster. So we have to deal with more things than we used to do. When I went to college many years ago, when I started out my career in the arboriculture profession, the things we dealt with seemed a lot smaller, a lot narrower, right? I would not have predicted, and I'm sure none of you would have either, predicted something like a pandemic, or thinking that we would be dealing with urban rural wildland interface fires like we have in the last 10 years. Now, I also, as I mentioned, I spent a bulk of my career working for the Oregon Department of Forestry. And in that context, I, in the summers, was on an incident management team managing wildfires. And so I have been on wildfire assignments in 9 western states. I don't consider Texas Western, is it? Any Texans here? Is it Western? 9 states, including New Mexico. I spent 2 weeks here back in the early 2000s on a fire assignment. So I have been, in my career, dealt with wildfire a lot. And I've usually done it at the level of managing incidents. So you see almost all the photographs in this picture are mine, and this particular one was as well. This was a blow up. I think this one was from a fire in Idaho. But in my experience working in a command and general staff situation with the incident command system, and you'll hear more about those things from speakers later this morning, it's about managing expectations, it's about managing opportunities, and it's really about having the willingness to learn lessons from what we encounter. So at the end of every fire assignment, the fire team, I was on a fire team for 10 years. I was the lead public information officer on a Type 1 national team. At the end of every fire, we would have a debrief where we would sit down and we would list all the lessons that we learned in that fire. And in 20 years of being in wildfire management, I never was at a fire where I didn't learn a lesson. Isn't that interesting? Never went to a fire where I didn't learn at least one thing. And sometimes those things were small, and sometimes they were very consequential. But in the context of working in the green industry, whether you're in New Mexico or in Oregon or in Nebraska or wherever, there's a lot of things to think about today, a lot more than there used to be. Because it's really not a matter of if a natural disaster is going to impact you, your job, your company, your organization, your city, your state. It's really when. And as you heard from the speaker, last year you had a rather impactful year in terms of what went on in the state, whether that is, and whether all those contributing factors are drought or insect and disease or urbanization creeping into the wildland urban interface, or take your pick. The reasons really aren't as important as our response. So when we look at what a tree encounters, we might focus on things like water and wind and precipitation, but those are really only the tip of the iceberg for us. And again, it doesn't necessarily matter where you're at. Now here in the state of New Mexico, you have a fairly defined plant palette. By the way, I'm very impressed by all the plants on the stage here. Whoever sponsored that, very nice job. Excellent work. I actually feel real in place here because I'm the only one with a girdling root around my neck up here with all these trees. So the question for us working in the green industry is, we know this is going to happen. What are we going to do about it? Well, what we've typically done is we've planned and managed disasters. That has been, I don't know, for the last 50 more years or more, the kind of the idea, the approach. Well, there's going to be a disaster, so we should plan for it, and we should respond it, and we should manage it. I think that we're starting to see a paradigm shift, a different way of looking at this, and looking at risk and how we manage risk. Because we know that there are going to be natural disasters, and the question for us is, what are we going to do about that? And the time to plan for a natural disaster is a day like today. Why? Because there isn't a natural disaster happening today. So the fact that we're not in it, and we're not in an event, is really the time that we should be paying attention to these sorts of things. Minimizing risk also has a really big wild card factor to it, and that is living with uncertainty. Because we can't be certain what the next disaster is going to be, or the conditions that we are going to be able to deal with it at any particular given time. So that first R then is risk. Now, if you want the textbook definition of risk, I've got it here on the screen for you here. This is one of my favorite fire pictures. This is taken by my ops chief on the team I was on, JP. And he took this picture. He says, "I got to share this with you." He goes, "Have you ever heard of Burning Man?" That's what he thought. That's what he wanted to call this picture. So this is JP's photograph, not mine, but I have his permission to use it. I just really love it. So risk is something that we have to pay attention to, that we have to understand, that we have to learn, that we have to communicate. And that risk and our level of reaction to it kind of depends on where we're at. If you're the head of a company or an agency or a program, you have a certain level of risk that you need to understand. If you are a climber, or you're an IPM specialist, or you're a chainsaw operator, you still have risk that you need to plan for. But those risks may be different. So the key, I think, in understanding risk is knowing what your risk is. What are you at risk for? And funny story here, you notice I wander a lot, and this is a really big stage and a really wide room. And so and when I talk, I like to have a presence on the stage where people think I'm looking at them. So I'm not going to just stand over here and talk to this group because there's another group all the way over here. Well, a couple of months ago, I got really close to the edge of the stage. And I went like this, and I almost fell off the stage. I didn't, but I almost. So it's like, okay, for me, my speaking style is I hate to stand behind podiums, and I got permission from the AV guys they're tracking me with a camera so that the folks online can follow me, because I don't like to stand behind podiums. But for me, a risk is not falling off the stage. So we're going to try to solve that today. So how do we understand risk? From a tree perspective, from an urban forestry, arboriculture perspective, we probably need to understand risk in two categories. We need to assess the risk, and then we need to manage the risk. When we assess risk, there are a couple of different pieces to that. There's a technical piece, a biological, a physical. Because remember, trees are biological organisms that are beset by the environmental factors that are around them. And remember that the number one job of a tree is to defy gravity. Someday that tree is going to come down, whether we take it down or whether Mother Nature takes it down. So that biological, physical relationship we need to be able to understand. Then we need to be able to manage risk. Risk has a political aspect to it, sometimes a legal one, an emotional one, an economic or financial one. Really a lot of aspects to it. This very large hunk of a tree down here, whoops, let me go back, was the national champion Sitka spruce near Seaside, Oregon. And I was a part of a team that had to decide when that tree it was 700 years old, and when that tree got so brittle and so unstable, we had to move a fence. We had to erect a fence 196 feet out from where that tree stood in order to keep the public away from it, because the risk of that tree falling on the public was unacceptable. Now, why was it 196 feet? Because the tree was 180 feet tall, and we wanted to provide a little margin of error there. It eventually, it fell apart, and we cut it, and we took the fence around. Now people can actually walk up and look at it. But it was a matter of trying to understand what the risk was to the visiting public. But this was such a significant and iconic tree that we were really limited in terms of the realistic things that we could do with this tree. All right, so after risk, we get to three more R's that are all related to planning: readiness, response, and recovery. Now, typically, when you see a state or a city or a company that has an emergency urban forest plan, these are the three R's that they look at. These are the planning R's. But again, they're not the first one I think you should lead with. I think you should lead with understanding risk. But we'll cover each of these three in succession. So what does readiness look like? Well, I think it's a matter of you're never ready for it. You're never really ready for anything until it actually happens, and you can't evaluate whether you're ready until you've actually been through that disaster. But in my experience working in wildland fire, we would have meetings every winter, again, when there aren't wildfires. Every winter, we would have meetings, and we would practice scenarios that might occur. Now, for many years in Oregon, we trained for a tsunami. That tsunami never came. That does not mean that time was wasted, right? Because the training that you do for a tsunami, 90% of it is the same thing you do for a training for an earthquake. And 80% of that is the same that you would do for a windstorm. So the respect of being ready transcends the type of disaster that we have. So first thing I think we need to talk about is, are the trees ready? And this has to do and pertains to our ability to keep the trees in our urban forest as healthy as possible. That starts with the proper planting, the proper selection of a site, the right tree, right place. That begins with young tree structural pruning. That begins with proper tree care when the tree is young. Then when you get to the point where the tree is old, as you see this white oak here, that has about is about ready to split due to the snow and ice load from the storm that we had in Oregon. We need to say, okay, is this tree going to withstand the next storm? It did withstand this one, but will it be ready for the next one? For us, the answer was no. We actually had to take that tree down because of that split that you see forming in the tree. Are the people ready? Again, I think training. How many of you have ever done aerial rescue training? A handful, okay. How many of you ever actually rescued somebody from a tree? Okay, you got to be ready to do it even though you might not have done it, but if you practice it, you will be ready for that time. So when we think about readiness, it's important that the people are ready for what they might encounter even if they never do. Safety response. The readiness for, so when we think about response, it's primarily a safety focus of that. That's our first angle. I mean, you want to make sure that everything gets picked up, that storm cleanup happens, but the first thing, the priority really in response has to be safe, because you want to keep the people safe in the process of doing the rest of the response. So don't ever underestimate the importance and the need for safety training, for tailgate sessions, for being prepared for the unexpected. Another response piece is operations. Many disasters result in an unexpected amount of biomass that all of a sudden has to be dealt with. One of my first experiences with this was in 1988. I was serving on the city forestry staff in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we had a late October snowstorm, which is incredibly early for southern Ohio. And the leaves were still on the trees. And the snow load on those hardwood trees that still had leaves on them was more than a lot of those trees could bear. We had so many broken limbs, we had so many trees down, we had so much biomass all of a sudden to deal with, and we were not prepared to do so. Fortunately, we were able to scramble and to think on our feet and to find a vacant lot, a very large vacant lot in the center of the city, and we brought all of this debris there. And that debris was logs, and it was broken branches and stumps and whatever we could do. But I remember I worked for about 40 hours straight. I think that's the only time in my life that I have worked for more than a day. I worked about 40 hours straight on this particular disaster with not a lot of sleep because we had to get streets open. We had to deal with all of the debris that was out there. We ended up finding a contractor who had a big tub grinder, and we brought that in and we ground it all in the mulch, as you see in the back of the photograph there. But that was my first experience many years ago with operations. And what the big message of that particular disaster for me, that was my first disaster, I was very young in my career at that point, was, boy, we were not prepared for that one. So what are we going to do to be prepared for the next one? And so we started a couple of interesting things. One, we started socking away money. We convinced the city council to increase our funding rate, and we started putting away money for an emergency response fund. And you know what? That disaster was fresh in their minds, and they said yes without a lot of arm twisting. It was amazing. I think that's about the easiest money I've ever gotten out of the city council. Because why? It was right at their forefront. They knew what kind of an issue it was and what kind of response that we had to make. And so for us, it was a great time to say, hey, we need some money to put away in the bank for the next time that this happened. Because they had to give us money to deal with the last one. Well, while we're asking for money to deal with the last one, we might as well ask for money to deal with the next one. Why? Because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Recovery. I think that when we talk about recovery, we need to consider both communications and finances. When we think about picking up after a storm, many people will get, one of the things I've found is many people will get a little bit gun shy. Oh, my tree fell, so I don't want another tree. Well, your tree fell because that's what trees do, but if you don't plant another tree, you're foregoing all those ecosystem service benefits that that tree would have provided to you. And as I mentioned, the finance is, it takes money to recover from disasters, and it takes money to plan for them as well. I think that we need to consider having the ability to replant and replace, and that might be an opportunity to replace with a more suitable species, or to replant in areas that maybe aren't as close to utility lines, for example, or are in areas that will allow us a little extra room to grow. And the really key is to how do we avoid a repeat? Now, when I say how do we avoid a repeat, in terms of a disaster, we're not talking about how we avoid repeating the disaster, because the disaster is going to happen. But how do we repeat the same response that we had before? In other words, what lesson did we learn from that, and how do we go forward? All right, the next R, resources. So if you're going to plan for a natural disaster, you need to think about what's in your toolkit to do that. Part of that is strategic thinking and planning about these 6 R's. And I think going to sessions like this, that's a resource for you. But you need to know where to go to get help. So, for example, the state, your state emergency management organization, your state forestry division, what kind of assistance can you get, your state extension specialists, your state universities, what benefits can you get, what information and knowledge can you acquire, again, when a disaster is not happening, to think about that. And maybe it's just a list. One of the things that I, in fire, was really kind of interesting is that when a fire would break out in a particular area of Oregon and we would dispatch a team, the first thing that the operations people would get would be a local list of all the available water sources. Why? Because we had to do helicopter drops, and we needed to know where the water was. And so if we came into an area, and we were from, the 30 of us on the team were from all areas of the state, there was somebody local there. But rather than them trying to explain right at that point where all the local water sources are for us to use the helicopters to dip from, here's the list of them. When did they prepare that list? In the middle of the winter, when it wasn't needed. So, part of this is really thinking about developing a mindset or a perspective of being ready for whatever will happen and what those contingencies might be. Particularly specific to urban forestry, I'd call your attention to a couple of resources. These are both available online. One's called Storms Over the Urban Forest, and it was produced by the U.S. Forest Service in the 1990s, so it is fairly dated. But there's still some really good information in that. This is the printed copy, but you can get a PDF of it as well. The second one, and I think probably the more useful one now, is by a group called Smart Trees Pacific, which is a nonprofit group like Think Trees, but they're out of Hawaii. And they developed an emergency operations guide for urban forestry. And I actually edited a couple chapters of this. I was a contributor to this publication. So I have really good confidence that this, that this was peer-reviewed and that it has really good information. But it helps explain the importance of local county emergency operations centers and how urban foresters and arborists can get plugged into those type of networks that are beyond trees, but yet have that infrastructure that's going to help us manage. So if I had to recommend any 2 resources, printed resources for you, those are the 2 that I would recommend. And changing your mindset and perspective, I think, is really is a matter of embracing that uncertainty that I talked about, and focusing on the ecological and social aspects of what might happen. So this photograph here is from Corvallis, Oregon, which is where I teach at Oregon State University. And as you can see, there's a nice row of fairly new townhomes on the right and burnt trees on the left. And that's how close this fire got to burning structures. It was started by a couple of kids playing with matches. Heard that story before. And it was in a wooded city park, and it was in a very dry, drought conditions. Oregon summers are sometimes will go months without rain in Oregon. And this burned up right to there. And boy, was this fire a wake-up call for the city of Corvallis. I have never seen so much defensible space planning going on in such a short period of time as when a fire is approaching a neighborhood like this one. So it's a matter of sometimes an event like this will help you change your perspective. Sometimes it's going to a conference like this, and thank you to the organizers of the Think Trees Conference for being willing to put this, decidedly non-tree topic at the forefront of this particular conference, because it's important. Why? Because it's not about trees. It's about all what happens with these disasters and how those influence our trees. And then, you've probably heard of the Semper Gumby motto, always be flexible, because you're going to have to be flexible in terms of how you approach this. And sometimes it's changing people's minds. And, we don't have the benefit of looking back. We don't have the benefit necessarily of always thinking what's going to or understanding what's going to happen in the future. True story. I sat on the board of directors of a nonprofit organization that will remain nameless, because you would know what it was if I told you. But I was on this board of directors, and it was the early 90s, and I went to the board one day and I said, hey, there's this new thing called the internet, and we need a web page for our organization. And I've got a college kid who's willing to design it for us and do it for $300. And the board said, a web page? Nah. It's like, we need to focus on trees. I go, no, you don't understand. This will help us focus on trees. And can you imagine, you wouldn't have the benefit of knowing today what, everybody has a web page, right? But in 1992 web pages were a fairly new thing. And I thought we needed one, and I had a hard time convincing my peers that we did, and I was right, but it wasn't just me. It was, it was where society was going. All right, the last R. Strive for resilience. So what is resilience? Resilience, the textbook definitions, the dictionary definition, would be the capacity to withstand adversity and recover quickly. So how does that look like for our urban forest? Well, it looks like planting trees that are going to be more resilient. It looks like training people to accept uncertainty and helping them understand the stress that they might encounter if they're dealing with a natural disaster. We've got to make the people as resilient as we do the trees. This photograph is from the town I was born in, actually, Toledo, Ohio. I haven't lived there in a long, long, long time. But at one time, it had a whole lot of really nice ash trees. And then this happened. Emerald ash borer. Same shot. Before and after. Later on today, you're going to hear two of my friends, both named Dana Coelho and Dana Karcher, talk about a little bit about emerald ash borer. You don't have emerald ash borer here. It might not be a big deal. But you know what? If you ever got the elm equivalent of emerald ash borer, you would have some significant problems. And we didn't know 30 years ago what emerald ash that emerald ash borer was going to come. We thought green ash, white ash cultivars, great, let's plant them. They grow fast, provide a lot of shade. But things like this then happen. All right. As I indicated to you, I am a college professor, which gives me certain prerogatives, and one of those is to call on people. You pop quiz. So what we're going to do now is crowdsource the 6 R's. What I'm going to ask you to do is to group up with some folks around you, and I don't care how many you want to do, 2, 3, 4, 6, whatever. But I want to kind of cluster up with some folks around you. And I want you to brainstorm some of the best practices for dealing with just one of these R's, and I've repeated them on the screen for you. And you'll see here and here to the front of this stage are some microphones. So what I'm going to ask you to do is group up, and I'm going to give you a little time. I'm a little behind schedule, but I'm going to give you some time to just brainstorm some best practices for dealing with one of those R's. Pick one, just group together, pick one, and then brainstorm some ideas. And then I'm going to ask for a couple people, we don't have time to do this for everyone, but I'm going to ask for a couple people to come up to the mic. And as an incentive, the fine folks at Think Trees are going to give you a rubber duck if you end up coming up to speak and to share your best practices. That rubber duck that you're going to get will be exchangeable for a free raffle ticket. I think it's to win that chainsaw, right, Tom? Okay, to win that chainsaw, good. Okay, for the folks of you that are online watching this, welcome and thanks for attending. This is the audience participation portion of the talk. So feel free to go grab a cup of coffee and come back in about 10 minutes and listen to what these folks have come up with. Then make that 7 minutes. All right, ready? Go. 7 minutes.
All right, guys, we got a couple of gifts here. Oh, did I drop it? Thank you. Well, I'm going to have to get my glasses. I can't read it. Okay, guys, we got a pair of clippers here. Number 9652000. I think they're Corona clippers. You can look on the board in the back if you don't hear the number.
is our house after the Cap Canyon
Oh my, look at
Hermit's
that.
Peak fire. They saved the house,
Yeah.
which was miraculous because it's ponderous pine. But it burned 75% of our forest.
Wow, yeah.
One thing
Yikes.
is, I had,
You got a metal roof there?
yes, and
Yeah,
I had
okay.
a defensible space around
Yep, yep,
the
good.
house. I have a brush hog.
Yeah.
And, but there was a fire prevention crew that came, and just before the fire, they set up a sprinkler system. So we had minimal damage on the house.
Yeah,
A lot
still,
of
that's a
other,
lot of trees to lose though. Ooh.
well, and a lot of other infrastructure.
Yeah, yeah,
So I decided to,
yeah.
we had, there were over 900 structures up north.
Yeah.
500 of which were houses. And it's really interesting. People came from all over, but, the recovery is very, very slow.
It is, yeah.
There's
Yeah.
just not enough people to do it.
Understood,
But anyway,
understood.
we were lucky.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. Thanks for sharing. All right, let me give you a 2-minute warning. If you could wrap up your conversations, 2 minutes, please. All right, come back to me if you will, please. What I'd like to do now is if we just get a couple of volunteers to come up to each of these mics here and just share your list of best practices with me. First thing I'd like you to do is say what which are you that your group talked about, and then give some just a couple of three, maybe do 3 top ideas. So, that's somebody waiting over here. Go ahead. Say your name and who you're from, please.
All right, Todd Haynes. I'm retired New Mexico State Forestry, but most of these ideas are from the rest of the group, so I'm just going to go on. They wanted to tackle readiness, so some of the ideas that came up with, they plant diverse species and at the proper spacing, so that way if any one species is going to be impacted by a disease or any other thing, or wildfire, they have a diversity to handle that. And also plant trees generationally, which I think they meant don't just have one planting and then you go to the old city and all the old trees die at the same time. You just do that over a series of time. And then and they also want to have readiness that's knowing, and they didn't want to do this, but knowing what the response would be and what the recovery would be and that type of thing. And then where to source some of the local material. And they came up with, just develop the list. And the only thing they could say is trees of corrales.
All right, Tom's got your duck. Thank you, Todd. Let me feedback to that real quick. And that is one key word that you use there is diversity. Whether that's diversity of species that are going to help you, diversity of ideas, diversity of the types of people that are involved with being ready. Those are all great ideas. So thank you. Over here.
Hello. We talked about...
What's your name? Where are you from?
Aaron. I'm Aaron with Legacy Tree Company here.
Hey.
We talked about resiliency, which seemed to be really linked to readiness. And just looking at the row of ashes, like if half those trees weren't ashes, they would still have a pretty good canopy. So some things are pretty easy. They're also all the same age, so just getting that diversity of ages in there. And yeah, that was it.
Excellent. Good. Thank you. Next.
Good morning, everybody. I'm from Seeds of Wisdom, Santa Fe. we talked about like resources, about using like parking lots for emergency reliefs. You know, setting up parking lots where we can store fallen trees or something. Also being able to map these systems out. And also talked about going after the funding for these systems, you know, maybe putting plaques around within these parking lots prior to it so that people are known this could happen, you know, in case of emergencies. So set up systems and mapping it out for people to know, and kind of resources that we can go around. There's a lot of resources we have in play within our communities that we can utilize, as well as finding the financial backing from it for emergencies, so that these companies or these groups that we're working with to store these trees in an emergency don't feel like they're being pushed out or their stuff is being utilized and they're not getting compensated for it.
Excellent. Good. Thank you. Let's go over here.
Rhett Sanders Spencer. I'm from the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, and our group talked about risk. What really stood out to us about the presentation was, you know, understanding your level of risk. And, you know, for our agency, we cover a lot of ground. So our level of risk kind of scales from this individual tree idea, you know, at an individual private property owner's property boundary to managing the entire bosque in Albuquerque. So kind of being able to kind of tap into resources for information when it comes to, you know, ecosystem level managing and partnering with universities that provide, you know, maybe they're collecting data on vegetation types and having access to that information. Just doing anything you can do to access information regarding your level of risk. I would say another way we wanted to understand risk was not only from like a fire or disaster response perspective, but the risk to us as an agency, or, you know, as a contractor. You know, if you don't do something that you're responsible for, like maybe that's why we're here, to kind of get a better idea of how to, you know, do risk assessment for trees. If we don't do what we're responsible for, there's a risk to us and being able to continue to operate.
Right.
So
good. Just great. Thank you. A quick story on risk. I was working with a tree group in Florida, and I went down there and met with them, and then we were doing some follow-up Zoom conversations. And I did a Zoom conversation. We had a Zoom conversation scheduled for Friday, I think it was September, and they called me up on Wednesday and said, hey, we need to cancel. We're in the path of this hurricane. We need to cancel our conversation on Friday. And one of the things we had talked about was risk. And I said, okay, what are you going to do about that brand new, $60,000 pickup truck that you just bought, for your tree crew? What's the plan for getting it out of harm's way of a hurricane? They did not have one. I was like, oh, we better put that on our list. Yeah, so you think of the risk. There's a whole lot of risks that we don't pay attention to. Over here.
Hi, I'm Karen Johnson from Green Summit, and we talked about readiness. And so one of the things that we talked about is being organized and like making sure we have things like all in their right places and ordered so we can actually find our things, and also making sure our tools are sharp, they're ready to be used at a moment's notice. Having a plan, the logistics, also making sure we have multiple dump sites ready for all of the debris. Another thing we talked about is how, a plan is only as good as the people who can execute it. So making sure that our people are ready and that they understand the plan. Yeah. And along with that, having our structure organized for communication so that people know how we're going to do the plan, who's going to talk to who's going to let people know. And number 7 is just prioritizing the crews, knowing, who's going to do what, and like who does this first, and having an order to put things out.
Excellent, excellent. These are all great ideas. Real quick on the readiness for people. If you're here today and your supervisor or boss is not here, and some of you probably are, you've got several people from the same group, but if your supervisor or boss is not here, when you get back to the office on Monday, tell them what you talked about here, okay? Because that's going to help them understand the value of sending you to trainings like this to help you understand risks. We might not get through everybody. Let's go real quick.
Yes, I'm Michael Grego with Parks and Rec City Greenhouse. And we had spoke about readiness, but also response too. It's in regards to the tree canopy, having a tree canopy replacement program, specifically with biodiverse, climate-ready native trees. You can work in conjunction with HOAs and local nurseries to then, create an urban plan, specifically with planning. You could do it with Parks and Rec and environmental health as well. And also introduce the generational planting. That's a great idea. That's something that, again, speaking with ideas, taking other people's ideas and running with them.
Good, thank you. Okay, go ahead, over here.
Okay, cool. Do you mind just going back to that last slide for me?
I can go back to the last slide, sure.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, my name is Harrison O'Connor. I'm the owner of Legacy Tree, and we took a slightly different approach to this task. Nathan from our group pointed out that irrigation is something that we always refer to, and especially here in the desert, our trees well watered, but something that we don't always focus on. So drip irrigation, and then Kayla from our group pointed out that developing a focus on this, and really it falls under the category of readiness, I would say. Resources and resilience, resources in terms of building those connections with professionals in that sphere, irrigation technicians, readiness, making sure our trees are well watered and not just dry fuel for a wildland fire. They create a resilience for our landscape, not just to wildland fire, but to secondary agents, fungal pathogens, so that we can really prepare for all of these different kinds of issues at the same time.
Good, thank you. Last one.
Jim Bassler, TR Verde Landscapes, Las Cruces, and I was talking with a guy from Coates Tree Service, and we were focusing on readiness, so we talked about some of the common sense stuff, of course, about, reducing weight load on the branches with the proper pruning, looking for disease, and elevating canopy, and the safe zones around buildings to suffer fire. But one of the things that it also brought up was, going all the way back to planting, and, inspecting root zones for your root balls for problems such as circling roots when it's in the container, making sure when the tree is planted you have deep water and good root system, not planting in little areas where you don't have room to spread out roots like in a street median and stuff like that, because if you don't get a good root system early, you get a windstorm later on, that tree's going to go over.
Yep.
And so that goes all the way back to the beginning, making sure when you're planting the tree that you're focusing on whether or not that tree is going to remain standing when you get a natural disaster.
Good, thank you. All right, let's give them all a hand that came up. If you spoke and didn't get your rubber duck from Tom's in the back there, see him afterwards. Thank you for my little crowdsourcing exercise here. I could have had you all up here give the talk instead of me. It would have been great. I've got a great story, which I don't have time to tell about this tree, but you can't do this to every tree to try to protect it, okay? I can tell you the story, but you can't put a big superstructure on every tree to protect it from a natural disaster. Although this guy tried. He was rich enough. This is up on Vancouver Island in BC. He was rich enough. He tried it. Summary: understand risk, plan for the next 3 hours, assess your resources, or access your resources rather, and then strive for resilience. Thank you for being here today. Here's 2 email addresses. Thank you. If you're interested in an online urban forestry or arboriculture class, there's my email for OSU. If you're interested in anything else, there's my company email. And all the planners at Think Trees have this as well. Now, here's your CEU number. The forms that you filled out, you will be able to write this one down, and we'll go from there. I will be here today only, and very early tomorrow morning. I have to fly out later tomorrow morning, so I won't be here for the question and answer session on Friday, but I will be around, so if you have specific questions, feel free to catch me at some point. All right? Thank you.